If your power falls off a cliff when riding in the heat and you're not sure what to do about it, then this video is for you. I'm Coach Daniel, scientist turned cyclist, and I help athletes like you get faster, including in the most grueling of conditions. Racing in the heat is a physiological problem with specific solutions. Most cyclists lose more time to bad heat strategy than to weaker legs. My wife and I just got back from 5 days of stage racing in Hainan, China, where the temperatures sat somewhere in the mid 30s to high 30s every single day, and the humidity made it even worse. Some people excel in the heat and others completely snap. I'm going to walk you through 3 evidence-based strategies you can use to give yourself the best chance of excelling in hot weather, and share one really extreme story from our race. Before we get to the strategies, you need to understand what's actually happening physiologically. Failure in the heat is not what most cyclists think. There's a cascade event. Your body has to dump heat mainly through sweat evaporation off of your skin. To support that, your body sends a huge fraction of cardiac output to the skin, diverting away from your working muscles. Sweating also costs a lot of fluid, which contracts plasma volume. And less plasma volume means less blood returning to the heart per beat, so stroke volume drops. To maintain that cardiac output, the heart rate climbs. This is cardiovascular drift. You're doing the same power, your heart rate is climbing, your core temperature is climbing, but you have decreased stroke volume from the heart. The international consensus on this is pretty ambiguous. Heat stress alone impairs aerobic performance once hyperthermia kicks in. Layer dehydration on top and the strain compounds. Your power falls off in the heat because the system supplying your muscles is being asked to do 2 jobs at once. It needs to cool you and fuel you, and it can't do both at full capacity. Each method we're going to discuss attacks a different part of that cascade. The most important intervention you can adopt to reduce physiological strain and optimize performance is to perform heat acclimation training. There's a seminal study showing why. 12 trained cyclists starting VO2 max around 66.8, already really strong riders, did 10 days of heat acclimation. 2 45-minute bouts at 40 degrees at 50% of VO2 max every single day. A matched control group with identical exercises did it in 13 degrees, and the results were pretty clear. In the cool conditions, where humans really race their best, VO2 max went up 5% from 66.8 to 70.2, and in hot conditions, 8%. Additionally, time trial power went up 6% in cool and 8% in hot, and lactic threshold up 5%. Plasma volume went up as well, and maximum cardiac output went up 9% in cool conditions, and the control group changed on none of these. That's one of the positive cases for heat training, and really the foundation of why heat acclimation became a really big tool in elite cycling. But the literature is split on the cool environment transfer of heat acclimation, and that's beyond the scope of this video. But the evidence is clear that heat acclimation helps you race in the heat. A meta-analysis pulled together 96 studies on heat acclimation, and the effect was pretty moderate to strong. The longer the protocol, the bigger the effects. Less than 7 days gets you most of the heart rate and core temperature adaptations, and past 14 days you start seeing full sweat response and hematological changes. And the cleanest time course we have comes from a 2024 study that took 20 elite male cyclists, 5 weeks of heat training, 6 1-hour sessions per week. After 3 weeks, total hemoglobin mass went up 3%, and after 5 weeks, up 4%. Sweat sodium concentration dropped down 14 millimoles per liter, and time to exhaustion in 40-degree conditions improved by 15 minutes. Peak power output in cool temperatures also went up 12 watts, and raw VO2 max didn't move significantly. Same pattern as the earlier study, the hematological adaptations transfers to cool, but raw VO2 max is harder to budge in heat alone. And here's the part most cyclists ignore. The same 2024 study tracked the decay. 2 weeks after heat acclimation ended, time to exhaustion in the heat was back to baseline. Hemoglobin mass was back to baseline. and sweat sodium conservation persisted, but most of the rest decayed really fast. The practical takeaway from this is if you have a hot race coming up, you need daily or near daily heat sessions, 60 minutes plus each, in a climate chamber, a sauna after a ride, or overdressing on the indoor trainer with the fan off for at least 2 weeks before the race. The consensus says a minimum of 1 week, optimal 2 weeks, and if you have 5 weeks, take the 5 weeks and finish your last session 2 to 5 days before the race. The decay is pretty brutal, so don't let it decay. Hydration is where most amateur racers in the heat lose the most time. In one study, 14 trained cyclists, average VO2 max around 63, were taken into 31-degree heat. They rode for 2 hours at 50% of VO2 max and performed a 15-minute time trial. Sounds straightforward, but this study was actually really clever because half the riders were blinded to their hydration status. Water was delivered through a tube through the nose into the stomach, so they couldn't tell whether they were drinking enough or not. Doesn't sound comfortable at all. One group of riders was delivered sufficient amount of water, and they lost about 0.6% of body mass, and the other group, purposely underhydrated, they lost about 3% body mass. Now, the unblinded group, the hydration group, was 10% slower in time trial compared to the hydrated group. And the blinded underhydration group, who didn't know they were dehydrated, was 11% slower. So no statistical differences between the two blind and unblind groups that were dehydrated. So they weren't slower because of any mentality or psychological reasons. The performance hit was physiological. 3% body mass loss in the heat cost you about 10% of your time trial completion time for a fixed amount of work. In a 5-day stage race where I lost 2 to 3 liters per stage, that's the entire margin between finishing strong and completely blowing up. Most athletes are showing up to the start line already in a dehydrated state. And in amateur races, you might have to wait up to an hour for your group to be released. But there's something that we can do about that. There is evidence-backed hyperhydration protocols that utilize glycerol at 1.2 to 1.4 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass, plus sodium at 3 grams per liter, in roughly 25 milliliters per kilogram of fat-free mass fluids taken in, taken 90 to 180 minutes before the start. This essentially expands your blood plasma volume and allows for 1.3 liters of additional fluid retention for a rider of my size at about 70 kilos for up to 4 hours after ingestion. It essentially turns you into a camel. And for the nerds out there, here's how. And yeah, these are actually my glasses I wear. Yes, I know, I'm a dork. Leave me alone. Glycerol is a 3-carbon osmolate. When it enters your blood, it raises the concentration of solutes, and because your blood maintains osmotic balance, water flows to the solutes. So when you ingest a meaningful amount of glycerol along with a meaningful amount of water and sodium, the glycerol pulls extra water out of your GI and into your circulation and holds it there. Plasma volume expands, urine output drops, and you start the race carrying close to a liter of extra fluid distributed throughout your blood and your tissues. And sodium is obviously also an osmolate and reinforces this effect. And the dose response is not linear, which is why the protocol is very specific. If you use below 0.5 grams per kilo of glycerol, you don't shift plasma osmolarity enough to drive meaningful retention. And if you go over 1.4 grams per kilo, your kidneys actually start to excrete the extra glycerol without proportionally more water held back. The 1.2 to 1.4 kilograms dose, taken with roughly 25 milliliters of water per kg of fat-free mass, is what the endurance literature converges on. The 90 to 180 minute window before the start matters because plasma glycerol peaks in that range. Too early and you already start to excrete it before the start, and too late and the osmotic gradient hasn't fully pulled the water in yet. 2 points to be careful with this if you're going to do it. If you don't take enough water when you do this, you will do the exact opposite. You will dehydrate yourself. And if your race has a lot of elevation gain, then it might be worth thinking about adding that 1 kilogram of extra weight in water weight. That's going to be a pretty big trade-off. Whether you use the glycerol protocol or not, during the race, target 400 to 800 milliliters of water per hour with sodium at about 20 to 30 millimoles per liter. That's 460 to 690 milligrams of sodium per liter, on the lower end of what most electrolyte drinks contain. Here's the operational problem that most amateur racers don't really think about, and that's in professional and semi-professional races. There's team cars, there's feed stations, there's motorcycles handing out water. You always have ways of getting water. That doesn't always exist in amateur races and Grand Fondos. In the Tour of Hainan, there were 2 to 3 feed stations per race, and if you're lucky enough to be in one of the lead breakaway groups, you also were able to get water from the official race cars and race motorcycles. In 35 degrees heat, your sweat rate can hit 1 to 2 liters per hour, and you can't carry that much on the bike. If your race doesn't have car support, you need to plan your feed zones really aggressively. Slow down as you approach them, grab as much water as you can. So the practical takeaway here is hyperhydrate the morning of the race. On the bike, drink 500 to 750 milliliters of water with electrolytes per hour. Have a plan for getting fluids every 20 to 30 minutes. And if you're racing in conditions where the feed is sparse, pre-cool with cold fluid intake before the start, and maybe consider that glycerol protocol. Now, this third method reduces the heat load itself, both before the race starts and during it. A 2017 review of cooling strategies during exercise made an important point. Pre-cooling has been heavily studied for years, but mid-cooling, cooling during the race itself, is the most underutilized tool. And combined pre-cooling plus mid-cooling tend to stack additively. Strategies with the strongest support include ice slurry ingestion before the race, typically a few hundred grams over 30 minutes, which can drop your core temperature half a degree to a degree before the start. Cold fluid ingestion during the race at around 6 to 10 degrees Celsius. And surprisingly, a methanol mouth rinse, which doesn't actually cool you, but tricks your thermal perception. There's a study showing it improves time to exhaustion in cyclists by about 9%. Cooling collars on the neck, water pulled over the head and face. Reported performance improvements across these strategies range from 1 to 8% depending on the method. Cold water immersion before the race is definitely the gold standard for pre-cooling. Sit in a tub at 10 to 15 degrees for 20 to 30 minutes before the race, but logistically impractical for most of us. Cooling vests are easier to use, but produce smaller core temperature reductions than full immersion. Worth using if you have one, not worth obsessing about if you don't. Now for the kit. This is where I want to slow down because there's a lot of marketing noise out there about breathable fabrics and not much science the average rider actually sees. So here's some physics here. Sweat doesn't cool you when it sits on your skin. Sweat cools you when it evaporates. Evaporation is the thing that pulls heat out of your body. Water absorbs about 2,260 joules of energy per gram as it converts from liquid to vapor, and that energy comes from your skin. So the job of a hot weather cycling jersey is not to absorb the sweat, it's to move that sweat away from your skin and spread it across a large surface area where it can quickly evaporate. This is what Coolmax fiber technology actually does mechanically. A standard polyester fiber has a round cross-section, whereas Coolmax fibers have a 4-channel cross-section, 4 grooves running the length of each fiber. Those grooves do 2 things. First, they create capillaries that wick moisture along the fiber by capillary action, pulling sweat away from the skin. Second, they massively increase the surface area of the fiber compared to a round cross-section. Roughly 20% more surface area per gram of material. Thus, the more surface area, the faster the evaporation. The combination means sweat gets pulled off your skin and spreads across the outer face of the fabric where it can evaporate efficiently. And this is what the Lameda Pro Coolmax jersey does that I wore for 3 of the 5 stages of the Tour of Hainan. In 35-degree heat with high humidity, the fabric never reached that over-soaked, clinging to the skin state that completely kills evaporation. And that matters more than people realize, because once your kit is saturated and stops wicking, you're effectively turned off from one of your major heat dissipation pathways. It kept me going, and if you want to give it a try for yourself, you can use the code BONK15 to save yourself 15% on your next order from Lameda. The practical takeaway: pre-cool with cold fluids or ice slurry 20 to 30 minutes before the start. During the race, drink cold water, pour cold water over your head and arms, on your neck when you can grab it, and wear a kit engineered to wick. The kit is not the biggest lever to pull in the video, but it's the one that you wear every single minute during a hot race. Everything I've discussed so far has been population level based evidence, but the response to heat is one of the most variable physiological responses that there is. One of my personal stories from this race makes it abundantly clear. During the 114 kilometer stage 2 race, my wife gained nearly 10 kilograms of body weight. Not muscle, not glycogen, water. She swelled up like a marshmallow. She lost it all within a week of the race ending, but why did this happen? Reheated heat stress over consecutive days can activate the ROS system, and aldosterone tells your kidneys to retain sodium, and then the water follows the sodium. Cortisol, also elevated under sustained physiological stress, contributes through similar mechanisms. So plasma volume expansion is actually one of the desired adaptations to heat training, and consecutive reports a typical 5 to 7% expansion with proper acclimation. But in some individuals, especially when heat stress is acute and prolonged with limited recovery between days, that fluid retention signal can dramatically overshoot. There is certainly a female-specific component to her body's heat reaction, and a 2021 review specifically examined whether menstrual cycle hormone fluctuations alter fluid and electrolyte balance during exercise. And the conclusion at the population level, group means show no consistent difference in plasma volume, sweat rate, or dehydration responses across cycle phases. But, and this is the really important part, individual variability dominates the data. Some women with high estradiol or progesterone fluctuations can experience disproportionate fluid retention or shifts in their osmotic threshold for thirst. The study mean tells you almost nothing about an individual case in females, which is definitely a topic to touch on for a future video. So what happened to my wife is consistent with a high individual response in the RAS pathway under sustained heat stress, possibly amplified by hormonal factors that are real for some women and irrelevant for others. Luckily, it resolved on its own once the heat exposure ended, but it did impair her racing. I mean, you try to race uphill after putting on 10 kilograms and see how fast you can go. Another individual variability that is pretty significant is body mass. Heat is generated proportional to body mass. Your working muscles are the heat source. Heat is dissipated proportional to surface area. Your skin is the radiator. So the ratio of mass to surface area is one of the dominant determinants of how a given heat load actually hits an individual cyclist. So this is a kind of a hard paper to read through because it's written by a biophysicist, not by a sports scientist. But the first thing we can take away looking at here is there's a lot of components that go into changing the core temperature of a person. And on one side, we have the body morphology, body composition, how much fat to muscle you have. Remember, muscle is what's producing a lot of the heat when you're working, and more fat lets you absorb a little bit more of that heat. And then changes in the body heat content. So we're going to take a look at a figure here that I think really distills this down quite well. And this actually took a look at cyclists, but we need to be careful how we read this figure. So this says 500 watts. So that's not power output. 500 watts, this is actually looking at rectal temperature during the exercise. Don't sign me up for that study. I'm not doing it. Of heat production from the individuals at 500 watts of heat production being done. And what we're looking at here is we're looking at in the open group here, this is the large group, so they weigh 90 kilos. And then in the small group, which is 67 kilos. And what we're seeing is we're seeing over the course of time, as time goes on, there's a greater increase in temperature, of core temperature, from the small riders versus the larger riders. So the larger riders at a consistent temperature output that the body is putting aren't having as much of a core temperature rise compared to small riders. So that's really interesting that if you're larger and you have different body composition, you're handling the heat a little bit differently. Okay, and the last figure I want to look at is this one here that's looking at the differences between total body mass and size in terms of how much surface area of skin you have. Now, why do we care about that? Well, we talked about evaporative effects, and that's actually the main way that humans have for cooling themselves down is evaporative effects. So if we take a look at larger riders, they're detailed here, versus smaller riders, right? So the larger riders already start off with a much higher capability of compensating for heat production. And as temperature increases, they do lose some of that capability, but they still retain a very large amount of it. Versus smaller riders already start off at a much lower capability, and then they also lose as well. Now, what's really interesting here, though, is this dark group. So this is actually a group that has the same surface area as the larger group, but they have an impairment with their skin that makes it so that they're not able to evaporative cooling as much. Now, what could that be? That could be really severe burns. And so this is actually showing that they are at the exact same amount as the small group. And they start off with a little bit higher than the small group, but they end up with lower as time goes on. So the amount of body mass that you have greatly impacts how you handle the heat. So the takeaway from that is there's going to be people who handle the heat better or not, just simply based on body composition and how much you weigh, how much surface area of skin you have. So this is just scratching the surface on all of this. There's so much that goes into how you handle the heat and why this is such an individual component. Racing in the heat is not a tougher version of racing in good conditions. It's simply a different problem with different solutions. And if you're a cyclist who performs well in the heat, you should treat that as a skill set and not look at it as a willpower test. The three methods I touch on, the heat acclimation, doing the 60 minutes before, 2 weeks before a race, is definitely the single most important thing that you can do to help with heat acclimation. Actively keep cool during the race, having those ice slushies or cold drinks while riding, and wear kit that wicks away the sweat like the Lameda Pro Cool Max jersey. And know your individual response. Track your weight, watch for being a high responder or low responder to the heat, and then plan for that in the future. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions about these methods, and if you want a dorky coach who treats the science just as seriously as the cycling, give me a follow. I'm Coach Daniel, and I'll catch you guys on the next ride.